Here's the question I get more than any other since this series started, and it's not from Protestants. Fine, you figured out you needed a church with real authority. You read the Fathers, you traced the canon, you swam past sola scriptura. But that argument gets you to the year 1054 and stops. Why Rome? Why not Orthodoxy? It's a fair hit. Everything I said in the first two videos, an Orthodox Christian could say word for word. They have apostolic succession. They have bishops in a line going back to the apostles. They have the Eucharist, the real one. They have councils, liturgy older than memory, monks on Mount Athos who pray more before breakfast than I do in a month. If the argument is, find the ancient church, there appear to be two ancient churches, glaring at each other across a 1,000-year-old crack. So let me tell you something I left out of my conversion story, because it needed its own video. I almost went east. For about 3 months, in the middle of that year I've been telling you about, I was attending a divine liturgy on Sundays. Incense, icons, the cherubic hymn, all of it. I read Kallistos Ware's book. I read Schmemann. There was a stretch in October where, if you'd asked me to bet, I'd have put money on ending up Orthodox. The aesthetics alone nearly did it. Nobody who has stood through a real divine liturgy jokes about Orthodoxy. So this video is not a takedown. This is me explaining, to people I still consider the closest thing Catholics have to brothers, why I eventually crossed myself left to right instead of right to left. And to do that, I have to correct the biggest myth in Christian history first. Almost everything you've heard about the year 1054 is wrong. There was no dramatic split that summer. Most Christians alive in 1055 had no idea anything had happened. The real break came a century and a half later, and it came with fire, and Catholics were holding the torches. Stay with me. This one goes places. Before the history, the ground rules, because this matchup is different from the Protestant videos. When the Catholic Church looks at, say, my old Baptist congregation, she sees sincere Christians, real baptism, and real love for Jesus inside a community that lost the sacraments and the priesthood. When she looks at Orthodoxy, she sees something else entirely, a true church, valid bishops, valid priests, a valid Eucharist, which means that on any given Sunday, Christ is as truly present on the altar of the Greek parish downtown as he is at the Vatican. Catholic teaching says this plainly. John Paul II liked to say the Church must breathe with both lungs, east and west, and he meant it as a description of a wound, one church holding its breath. The Orthodox, for their part, tend to return the compliment with more suspicion, and given the history you're about to hear, I understand why. Here's what I found in those 3 months that every Catholic should know before opening their mouth. Orthodoxy is not Catholicism with beards. It kept things the West let get dusty. The liturgy is treated as heaven touching earth, and it feels like it. Fasting is real. My Orthodox friends drop meat and dairy for the whole of Lent, while I negotiate with myself about Fridays. Their theology of salvation, theosis, the idea that God became man so that man might become a partaker of the divine nature, is straight out of 2 Peter, chapter 1, verse 4 and the Fathers. And hearing it preached, rearranged my furniture about what heaven even is. None of that is a rival claim to Catholicism. Nearly all of it exists inside Catholicism, especially in the Eastern Catholic churches. But the East never misplaced it. So when I say I chose Rome, understand the weight of the choice. I wasn't choosing between the church and a counterfeit. I was standing in front of two ancient claimants, both with real credentials, and the deciding question turned out to be the same question that started this whole series. It usually is. But first, what actually happened? The story as usually told, in July 1054, a papal legate named Cardinal Humbert marched into the great church of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople during the liturgy, slapped a document of excommunication on the altar, and walked out. The patriarch excommunicated him back. Boom, great schism. East and West. One church becomes two. Date it like a divorce. Nearly every detail of the drama is true, and the conclusion is false. Start with the legal fine print, because it matters. Humbert's document excommunicated Patriarch Michael Cerularius, personally, plus 2 of his associates. Not the Eastern Church, and here's the detail history students love. Pope Leo IX, who had sent Humbert, had died 3 months earlier, in April. A legate's authority dies with the Pope who commissioned him, so Humbert was arguably waving a piece of paper with no legal force at all. Cerularius, in turn, excommunicated the legates, not the Pope, and certainly not the Western Church. 2 grumpy delegations excommunicating each other on questionable paperwork in a city most Western Christians would never see. And then everyone went home, and nothing happened. No bells tolled across Europe. Trade continued. Intermarriage continued. Clergy concelebrated in border regions for generations. Pilgrims from the West kept venerating relics in the East. When the First Crusade arrived in the East 40 years later, it came, at least on paper, to help the Byzantine emperor, who had asked for help. Ordinary Christians in 1100 did not think of themselves as belonging to divided churches. Historians have combed the records. There is no year you can point to where East and West woke up and said, "We are now two." The schism wasn't an event. It was a drift, and 1054 was one loud creak in a hull that had been taking on water for centuries. What was the water? Mostly mundane things. Language. The West stopped reading Greek. The East never learned Latin, and by the 800s, the 2 halves of Christendom literally could not read each other's theologians. Augustine, the towering mind of the West, went untranslated in the East for 1,000 years. Politics. In the year 800, the Pope crowned Charlemagne Emperor of the Romans, which landed in Constantinople roughly the way it would land in London if the Pope crowned someone King of England while the actual king sat on the throne. Rite and custom. Leavened bread in the East, unleavened in the West, married priests in the East, celibates in the West. Each side, increasingly convinced its custom was the apostolic one, and the others a corruption. Add the Photian controversy in the 860s, a nasty fight over who was rightful Patriarch of Constantinople that dragged the Pope in as referee, and you have 2 halves of one church that had stopped talking, stopped reading each other, and started keeping files. Then came the event that actually did it. Not 1054, 1204. The Fourth Crusade set out for Egypt, ran out of money, got entangled in Byzantine dynastic politics, and ended up doing the unthinkable. A Crusader army besieged, breached, and sacked Constantinople, the greatest Christian city on earth. For 3 days, men with crosses sewn on their shoulders looted churches, smashed altars, stole relics by the shipload, and, in the detail every Orthodox child learns, seated a prostitute on the Patriarch's throne in Hagia Sophia, while soldiers drank from chalices. The Pope, Innocent III, had explicitly forbidden the attack, and when he heard what happened, he wrote in fury that the Greeks now saw in Latins nothing but an example of perdition and the works of darkness. He was right, they did. After 1204, the drift became a wall. Reunion councils were attempted, at Lyons in 1274 and Florence in 1439, and delegates actually signed at Florence. The Eastern faithful, remembering 1204, refused to ratify what their bishops had signed. Within a few years, Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, and the schism froze in place, where it remains. I'm telling you this bluntly for a reason. In 2001, John Paul II went to Athens and apologized for 1204, and in 2004, the relics of 2 great Eastern saints were returned from Rome. When I present the Catholic case in a minute, I'm not presenting the case of a church with clean hands. There are no clean hands in this story, which is exactly why the question can't be settled by pointing at sins. It has to be settled by the claims. Strip away the politics, the bread, the beards, the burned city, and the dispute comes down to 2 words and 1 chair. The 2 words are, "and the Son." The chair is Peter's. Take the words first. The Nicene Creed, in its original form from the councils of 325 and 381, says the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. That tracks John chapter 15 verse 26 exactly. Centuries later, the Latin West began reciting proceeds from the Father and the Son, in Latin, Filioque. It seems to have started in Spain in the 500s as a guard against Arianism, spread through the Frankish Empire, and was finally adopted in the Creed at Rome itself in the early 1000s. The East objected, and still objects, on two levels. The theological objection: it confuses the persons of the Trinity, making the Spirit's origin double. The procedural objection, and listen closely, because everything hinges on noticing this: nobody has the right to alter the creed of an ecumenical council. Not a local synod in Spain, not the Frankish court, not even, says the East, the Pope. Now, on the theology itself, I'll give you the short version and link a full video later. The Catholic Church teaches the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son as from one principle, and Scripture calls him both the Spirit of God and the Spirit of his Son. Galatians chapter 4, verse 6. Jesus breathes the Spirit onto the apostles in John chapter 20. Eastern fathers like Cyril of Alexandria wrote things nearly identical. The agreed statements of the last 50 years of Catholic Orthodox dialogue have concluded, repeatedly, that the two traditions are describing one mystery with two grammars, that proceeds from the Father through the Son, a formula many Eastern fathers used, and the Latin filioque, rightly understood, do not contradict. Many serious theologians on both sides now say this issue alone would not keep the churches apart, which leaves the chair. And notice something about the filioque fight itself. Even at its hottest, it was never really a fight about the Trinity. Both sides confess the same three persons, one God. The fight was about whether anyone on earth had the authority to touch the creed. The East said only an ecumenical council can. The West said Peter's successor can confirm and clarify the faith of the whole church. Do you see it? The two real issues are one real issue. Everything in this 1,000-year argument, everything, terminates in a single question. What exactly did Jesus give Peter, and does the Bishop of Rome have it? Here's how the two sides frame it, fairly. Orthodoxy says, Peter had a primacy of honor, and Rome inherited it. First among equals, protos, the senior brother among the patriarchs, entitled to be heard first and respected always. What Rome does not have, says the East, is universal jurisdiction, the authority to intervene in any church, settle any dispute, and define doctrine for all Christians. Authority in the church lives in the whole college of bishops gathered in council, as at Nicaea, as in Acts chapter 15. Catholicism says the primacy is real authority, not protocol. And rather than argue from feelings, let me show you the 4 data points that moved me. 2 from Scripture, 2 from history, all of them things I checked with my own eyes. First, Matthew chapter 16. Jesus renames Simon as Peter, rock, and says, on this rock I will build my church. And then, the verse people skip, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Keys, in the Bible, are not decor. Isaiah chapter 22, the king of Israel had a chief steward, and placing the key of the house of David on his shoulder, made him master of the palace, second authority under the king, an office that passed from man to man. Every Jewish reader of Matthew knew that background. Jesus, son of David, appointing a steward with keys, was doing something with a job description attached. And notice, in Luke chapter 22, Jesus tells Peter, singular, I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. In John chapter 21, the risen Christ, 3 times, tells Peter alone, feed my sheep. Not honor among the sheep, feed them. Second, the New Testament's own habits. Peter is named first in every list of the apostles, and Matthew literally writes, first, Simon, who is called Peter, when first isn't a counting word, since no one is labeled second. He speaks for the 12 at Caesarea Philippi, at Pentecost, before the Sanhedrin, and in Acts chapter 15, at that Jerusalem council I keep coming back to. The assembly debates until Peter rises, and the text says, the multitude fell silent, and James, the local bishop, then frames his ruling around what Peter declared. Council and Peter, together. That's the Catholic model, drawn in the Bible's own hand. Third, a piece of history I find almost unfair. It's so convenient. Around the year 96, the church in Corinth deposed its clergy in a squabble. The Church of Rome wrote them a long letter, firmly instructing them to restore order, apologizing for not intervening sooner, and expecting obedience. That letter, First Clement, still exists. You can read it tonight. Now here's the thing. The Apostle John was still alive, in Ephesus, a short sail from Corinth. Corinth's dispute gets settled not by the living apostle next door, but by a letter from Rome, and the Corinthians treasured that letter so much they were still reading it at Sunday liturgy 70 years later. Nobody involved found any of this strange. Explain that with a primacy of protocol. Fourth, the East's own behavior for the first 1,000 years. When Athanasius was deposed by Eastern councils, he appealed to Rome, and Pope Julius reinstated him. When John Chrysostom, the greatest preacher Constantinople ever had, was exiled, he wrote to Pope Innocent for redress. At the Council of Chalcedon, in 451, 600 Eastern bishops heard Pope Leo's letter read aloud and cried out, "It's in the Acts of the Council. Peter has spoken through Leo." You can argue those were courtesies and rhetorical flourishes. You have to argue that about a lot of incidents, over a lot of centuries, all of them bending the same direction. Is the historical record complicated? Yes. The East can produce counter-quotes, canons about Constantinople's rank, moments when councils resisted popes, and an honest Catholic admits the papacy of 400 looked humbler in its machinery than the papacy of 1870. Development is real. Catholics say the acorn grew, the East says a tumor did. Reading the sources will get you a long way, and I've put a reading list in the description with sources from both sides. But I'll be honest with you about what finally decided it for me, because it wasn't a quote from 451. It was watching what happens to each system when a real fight breaks out. Run the coffee shop question from video 1 against both churches. When Christians disagree about doctrine, who has the authority to settle it? Rome has an answer you may hate, but it's an answer. The College of Bishops with Peter at its head, able to convoke a council, define the question, and bind the church. The system has an error-correcting mechanism, and it demonstrably runs. It ran at Nicaea against Arius, at Trent against the Reformers' claims, at every crisis since. Now ask the East the same question, with love, because this is the question that kept me from going east, and I've never heard it answered to my satisfaction. Orthodoxy holds that the supreme authority is the ecumenical council. Good. Who convokes one? Historically, the answer was the Roman emperor. Constantine called Nicaea. Emperors called the rest. The last council the Orthodox universally recognize as ecumenical was in 787, 12.5 centuries ago. There is no emperor anymore. And when the Orthodox churches attempted a great and holy council in Crete in 2016, planned for over 50 years, intended as the first pan-Orthodox gathering in modern times, 4 of the 14 churches, including Moscow, which contains well over half the world's Orthodox faithful, declined to attend, and its authority is disputed within Orthodoxy to this day. The mechanism exists on paper. It has not been able to run at full authority in over 1,000 years. And the disputes are not hypothetical. In 2018, the Patriarch of Constantinople granted independence to a Ukrainian church. Moscow declared communion with Constantinople broken. As I record this, the 2 most important sees in Orthodoxy are out of communion with each other, and there is no referee, no court, no chair, whose ruling both sides recognize. Each side calls the other uncanonical, and the schism just sits there. Contraception. Some Orthodox jurisdictions forbid it, some permit it within marriage. A couple can get opposite spiritual direction by driving across town. Remarriage after divorce, permitted up to 3 times, with different liturgies and different reasoning, by different synods. Ask, what does Orthodoxy teach, on a contested moral question, and you often get geography instead of doctrine. Please hear the tone here. This isn't a sneer. These are family arguments in a family I nearly joined, and Catholics have plenty of internal chaos of our own, which I'll never pretend otherwise about. The difference is structural, and it's the whole point. When Catholicism fights, there is a place the fight can end. When Orthodoxy fights, there isn't, and the proof is a millennium long. A church built to be conciliar has not managed a universally recognized council since before Charlemagne, and the most plausible explanation for why is painful and simple. The councils of the first millennium worked because there was an empire to summon them, or a primacy to anchor them. Remove both, and the machine seizes. The East kept the councils, and lost the thing that made councils possible. One of the great Orthodox theologians of the last century, Father Alexander Schmemann, wrote honestly about this, calling the lack of a functioning universal primacy a real problem for Orthodoxy. The best Orthodox minds feel the ache. The ache has a name and an address, and the address is in Rome. That's why I crossed left to right. Not because the East is dark, it's luminous. Because the argument that pulled me out of Protestantism, the Church needs a living authority that can actually settle things, doesn't stop at 1054. It keeps walking, and it walks to the chair of Peter, because that chair is the only institution in Christendom that even claims the job Jesus described when he handed a fisherman the keys. 2 last things, one hard and one hopeful. The hard one, for my fellow Catholics, we don't get to win this argument with a smirk. The list of Catholic contributions to this schism is long, and 1204 sits at the top of it, unpaid in full by any apology. If an Orthodox Christian bristles at Roman claims, remember that his tradition kept the faith under the Ottomans and under the Soviets, at a price in martyrs' blood that Western Christians can barely imagine, and it did so without any help from the Pope's authority. Humility first, always. The hopeful one. This schism is not frozen anymore. In 1965, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras lifted the excommunications of 1054, both of them, in a joint declaration, consigning them, in their words, to oblivion. Popes and patriarchs now meet, pray, and issue common statements. The theological dialogues on the Filioque and on primacy have moved further in 50 years than in the previous 900. Rome has said, since John Paul II's letter, Ut Unum Sint, that she's willing to discuss how the primacy is exercised, to find, quote, a way of exercising the primacy which is nonetheless open to a new situation. The gap that remains is real. It's the gap this video is about, but for the first time in a millennium, both sides are looking at it, instead of at each other's sins. I don't think I'll see reunion in my lifetime. My priest disagrees. He thinks the pressure of a post-Christian world will do what centuries of councils couldn't. Either way, when it comes, it won't be a merger or a surrender. It'll look like what Jesus prayed for in John chapter 17, and what a church with 2 lungs sounds like when it finally exhales. The challenge this week goes 2 directions. If you're Orthodox, I want your best answer to the referee question, and I mean the strongest form of it. Not, we don't need a pope, but positively, when Moscow and Constantinople anathematize each other, what, inside Orthodox ecclesiology, is supposed to resolve it, and why hasn't it in 7 years? Best answer gets its own video, same standing promise as always, and for this topic I'll bring an Orthodox source list on screen so you can check every claim I made. If you're Catholic, read 1 Clement this week. It's short, it's free online, and it's the closest thing you'll ever get to hearing the Church of Rome speak while an apostle still walked the earth. Subscribe for the next one. I read the early church fathers, and they weren't Protestant. We've quoted the fathers in every video so far. Next time we sit down and actually read them, and I'll show you the 5 passages that made my jaw hit the floor. This is actually Catholic. And to my Orthodox friends watching, the candle I light today is for you. I mean that. God bless.